Hello, and welcome to another episode of 2MFers. I, of course, am Brax Night Fighter, and as always, I have Rem here with me. Rem, how you doing?
Doing great. How you?
Doing well. We are here to have our fourth and final episode that we kind of center around guild management. And I know in the past few episodes, we've talked about our culture, and we've talked about recruiting, and we've talked about goals. And now we're going to kind of talk about player development and how we develop players to better the guild.
And the great thing about this subject, it's I think the first time that the average player actually, within a guild, the average player within a guild has an opportunity to affect the overall uh, guild. This is the one place where this is not uh, uh, a pure officer decision. Now, none of these things that we've talked about should ever be pure officer decisions. We talked about the sort of structures that officers are trying to create for guilds, but every member should feel like they have a voice as they're playing within those environments. But this is the one place where officers need more of the players' help than what they can do themselves. But with that said, no guild is going to be alike when it comes to player development. If you're a casual guild, you're going to have player development, but it needs to be realistic to what you're trying to accomplish. If you're a competitive guild, it's obviously going to be much more intense, the sort of player development that you do. It's going to be affected by the 3 points that we have already talked about, which is why we left this subject for last. And that's the concept that if you set your guild culture through your guild rules correctly, and if you recruit the right players and you put the right goals, it should almost necessarily dictate what sort of work you need to do in player development.
Yeah, I think we talked about that. The previous three subjects that we've talked about have kind of paved the way as far as developing that player and what where you need to take them and help guide them. Um, and so I think it kind of introduces that challenge and everything like that. And so you've already said, this is our expectation. We brought you in, we've set some goals, so now we need to do what we need to do to get you there.
And this is, again, like I said, true for every level of guild. Um, Even in a casual guild, there still needs to be, that give and take between the conversations of the player and what you as a leadership team or you as a guild culture are trying to encourage. You need to be able to offer advice, understand what could help a player, understand how to develop that player into meeting at previously said guild goals, culture, and so on. And so it's a constant give and take dynamic. It's one of the reasons why here in the alliance we encourage Discord so heavily. Although we in Mustafar have a lot of these conversations just generically and in game chat. You'd be amazed how many of the players do a great job of talking with each other and working these things out without the interaction or the interference of officers.
Yeah, and I think in kind of to your point about this being a lot of player led development and everything too, is that this is one of the things that isn't specifically officer driven, like you said. Um, and so it's not always officer to player development. A lot of times there's a lot of player to player development because if we're speaking about Mustafar, like we've got a lot of experience and a lot of great players in our guild that they may not be officers, but they have a lot of knowledge and they do a lot of things that help the guild. So, it's good to kind of encourage those situations where you kind of have I hate to say peer to peer, but where people that are on the same level are actually helping coach each other and make each other better.
I can admit there have been multiple times when I have watched some of those chats and not necessarily agreed with the advice that was being handed back and forth, but chose to stay out of it just for that reason, to continue to encourage those discussions. In the case of Mustafar, unless the advice is egregious and is completely against the goals and the purpose of where we're going, I try to allow the players the ability to have those discussions and figure things out a lot on their own, because I think that's healthier for player development. That you learn the game deeper when you're having to do your own research.
Yeah, and in the worst case scenario, it at least creates conversation that can be had. And so, there's nothing wrong with somebody saying, well, I think this, or I think this, and they I don't want to say an argument, but they can have a disagreement and they can talk about that. And throughout that whole conversation, everybody that's involved in that learns something.
It's one of the big reasons why we've always pushed on the need for communication within a guild, whether you're casual or highly competitive, having at least that level of communication, even those that aren't necessarily participating are reading it.
Yes. I think there's been times that we've had conversations out loud that we really knew probably the answer to, but it's better just to talk about it out loud just so that people can see it and get the information that's in our heads.
Absolutely. Agreed. Which brings us sort of the other piece. If within a guild, one of the parts of player development is allowing players to understand how their track of their planning and what they're building and what they're after, how it's going to affect those goals. I mean, I don't think anyone, depending on how competitive you are, ever is upset that somebody is building their sort of favorite team. I was a huge fan of Ewoks growing up, so I'm going to build the Ewok team because I love Ewok. But there does need to be, as an individual player, an understanding that while you can have your fun in the game, you also need to support your guild, and you need to be building teams at the same time that will support your guild culture and goals.
Yeah, and I think at that point, as a player, you have to ask yourself, like, you know, do I want to build this team just to have fun with, at the expense of all of my fellow guildmates not being able to help contribute to that thing? And so, um, I guess in that situation, we would hope that you would think about the guild first, and then make your side team sort of the your side farm or whatever. But I think you need to think about the whole goal, the whole guild as a whole.
Yeah, and this obviously differs by the type of guild that you entered into, which goes back to our concept when we talked about recruiting. If you're not somebody who's going to build for the guild, then you shouldn't be entering a guild that has those levels of expectations. You should be looking at something more casual. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're somebody who's highly competitive, well, then you're not going to have as much time or resources to be able to put into side farm. Uh, but I will say, with you also have to be very focused. Once you start a farm in this game, you need to finish it. That's a whole nother conversation. That's more meant for something that Mangry and Lab are more qualified to talk about. But So there's a balance that you have to play when you're playing this guild. It needs to be or playing in this game, it needs to be fun, but you also need to look at those bigger picture issues that your guild is putting in front of you.
Yeah, and I guess I'm assuming here, but I think most players, they want to be successful. They want to move forward in the game, and they want to or reach the highest point possible. And so sometimes to get to that, you have to sacrifice a little bit, and you have to give like to your guild, like giving to your guild is going to help you in the long run to become a better player. So there are times you have to make that sacrifice, and you have to understand that by not focusing here and focusing on what the guild needs me to focus on right now is actually going to help me in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely help you grow. So, if you had to give advice to another guild officer right now, what would you say is the most successful tactic for helping a player grow?
Well, I know me personally, I kind of use this checklist, and I know we've had some people in the past ask, how do you decide when you need to kick a player or get rid of a player or move them to another guild or whatever. So I know me personally, these are the questions that I ask myself. I say, have I or have we communicated the goals of the guild or the goal, whatever we're focused on? And then have I made that goal realistic and attainable? And have I given all the information possible to that person? Have I shared the resources needed and everything? Have I communicated to that individual how they're doing towards that goal? And have I offered help to them when they need it? And if I've gone through all that, essentially I've put the ball in their court at that point because I've given them everything that I can give them. I've communicated everything to them. I've helped them as much as I could. So the ball's in their court, and if they decide at that point that they can't produce or to attain goals or whatever, then that's when you kind of have to look at, maybe it is time that we move them along or part ways or whatever.
I think you made all the points necessary for an officer in how you work with a player and push them forward. You're trying to hold them accountable, but you want to give them the tools to where they can meet the goal. I remember a player that used to a couple of years ago drive me crazy and was always on my. I was looking for a reason almost because that's how much they were driving me crazy. And now they're one of our best players because we as an officer group put the effort into getting them re-engaged with the game and developing their roster in a way that it is now one of our it's now a roster that contributes more to the guild than majority of our other rosters, and it was just by putting work into working with that player who always wanted to be a successful player.
Yeah.
So you
And
there go ahead.
I was just going to say communication is the biggest thing there because a lot of times just by having a conversation like, hey, just checking in, seeing if you understood this or if you needed help with it or whatever. Sometimes players they don't know what they don't know, and so just by having that conversation and everything, you can help bring them to light. And maybe sometimes it's a conversation that gives them a swift kick in the butt or whatever, but um, if rarely are things ever fixed by not saying anything.
Well, and so I was gonna answer, I think our next point is what can a player do to be a good partner in this relationship? And you basically just said it. Communication. If you ever feel like you're swamped, if you ever feel like you're falling behind, reach out to the community. reach out to your officers, reach out to the alliance chat, and ask, hey, here's what my guild is trying to accomplish. What can I do with my roster in order to help them accomplishment? There's a lot of information out there, and it's way too much for any one person, especially a player that is just wanting to log into this game a few times a day, enjoy the fun of playing this game. To be able to absorb, the easiest way to do that is to engage the community occasionally and ask the community, hey, what could I be doing with this roster that would make me attain these goals faster?
Yeah. And I think every player needs to understand that, you know, as officers, we're going to help to better each player and to develop the guild and everything like that. But everybody has um, a responsibility for their own personal development as well. So if you feel like you aren't getting the enough information or the correct information, then ask for it. Like, ask for clarification. Go to other sources. As Rem said, that there's plenty of resources within our guild, within the alliance, definitely, and even within the whole Star Wars Galaxy Heroes community. Like there's so much information, and to be fair, at times it could be misinformation. Um, and not to say that the information I'm spewing right now is all 100% accurate, but um, there's a lot of information out there, and so we can't, as players, can't be afraid to ask for help. I know even as officers, like between in our guild, like we have a lot of conversations. Like, hey, we're struggling with this. How do you guys do? What do you guys do to attain that? So, keep that line of communication open, whether it be with your officers, whether it be with other players, whether it be with other guilds. It can never hurt to ask.
I absolutely agree. And I will leave or end this conversation on one other thing regarding player development. Mods, 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 mods. Don't forget your mods.
They make a big difference.
All right. So where are we heading next with our conversations, Brax?
Well, I think if we were just going to recap our whole um, our whole guild management, I think we've talked about how it's important to develop a culture. Um, it's a culture that you can support, a culture that your officers are going to support. Um, you need to recruit the right people into your guild, to make sure you have the right players that are going to be able to fall in line within your culture. You need to set good goals for the guild, and always keep them moving forward. Because when you're sitting there spinning your wheels, nobody's having fun. And then, as we talked about today, develop your players to be better players, but also to help your guild. And I think that pretty much summarizes kind of our take on how to manage your guild. And unless you have something to add to that, Rim, we can basically kind of set up where 2MFers is going to go from here.
I think the only thing I would add, this wasn't purely designed to just tell officers or future guild leaders uh, how to manage a guild. I think, especially with the Alliance, most every officer and guild leader knows how to manage a guild. This was more to kind of allow the average player to understand the kind of work that is being put in, the philosophies that we are operating under, uh, so they can better understand how to work with us, to work with their officers, to work with uh, their guild leaders to produce a better guild. Information is key. Knowing how the soup is made is a big deal, and every one of our members has a play within the success of our guilds. This isn't officers dictating. This is a two-way street. This is a cooperation. This is people working together to a have fun, create a community, friends, and just enjoy a really in great game and a great franchise.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, I think we will begin to sign off. For those of you that follow 2MFers, got a couple projects coming up down the pipeline. Probably the next thing you may hear from us, we're going to have a little collaboration with Mangry and talk a little bit about player types. And then we've got a few other little projects in the works. So I'm going to sign off. Rem, thank you for being here and sharing your wisdom.
Hey, I always enjoy these. I learn as much from you as I do from the game. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Absolutely.